January 12, 1943. The night over Guadalcanal carried a damp, metallic chill, the kind that clung to a soldier's skin long after he stopped moving. The jungle was a maze of dark silhouettes, its branches bowed under the weight of constant rain. Far beyond the coconut palms, gunfire cracked in uneven rhythm, sharp, disciplined bursts followed by long, unnerving silence. On a rise west of Point Cruz, an American sniper lay motionless in the wet soil, his breath thin and steady. He carried a rifle unlike any other on the island, a civilian hunting piece with a walnut stock rubbed smooth by years of use. It was simple, almost delicate compared to the thick, regulation-issued weapons of the U.S. Army. Yet its presence here, in this unforgiving battlefield, would soon overturn a German belief that had grown unchallenged since Poland, France, and the Low Countries fell in quick succession. The Germans had long judged Americans as soft men, factory workers, schoolboys, and farmhands with little instinct for the refined craft of sniping. Their doctrine suggested that precision belonged to the nations shaped by centuries of continental war. In their view, Americans were industrialists, not hunters of men. And so, when word filtered to their advisors in Tokyo that a U.S. sniper on Guadalcanal was carrying a mail-order sporting rifle, the reaction was predictable: disbelief, followed by laughter. They believed such a weapon revealed naivete, and that the man behind it must be an amateur, someone blind to the professional nature of the German and Japanese marksmen facing him. But the jungle was about to silence that arrogance with the cold finality of truth. The man on the ridge, Lieutenant John George, pressed his cheek to the smooth stock and listened to the jungle's quiet tremor. In the darkness, the symbolic detail that had followed him since boot camp came back to him, the sound of an empty cartridge rolling across a wooden table. It was the sound that first taught him patience. And here, on Guadalcanal, that faint metallic click echoed through his memory like a reminder of American abundance, not of weapons, but of opportunity, of time, and of personal skill earned far from European doctrine. For 7 days before this moment, Japanese snipers had turned the area around Point Cruz into a deadly grid. 14 Americans had fallen in 72 hours. Each shot came from deep concealment, the enemy confident that their craft, borrowed from German training and refined through jungle warfare, could not be matched. But John George did not hunt them with regulation thinking. He hunted them the way he once hunted deer in the hardwoods of Kansas: by breath, by intuition, by understanding how a living target blends with the land. To him, the Japanese snipers were not ghosts. They were men who made choices, and choices left patterns. A canopy branch bent too low. A fern broken too cleanly. A patch of darkness that did not sway with the wind. On the 4th day, the laughter in Germany ceased. Reports reached their advisors that the American with a civilian rifle had eliminated 9 enemy snipers with clean, single-round precision. Each shot was methodical, delivered through the Lyman optics that had once been intended for elk and wolves. And each kill was found at astonishing distance under jungle conditions that should have made detection impossible. By the 7th day, the number rose to 29. German analysts, reading Japanese reports, began questioning the assumptions that had shaped their understanding of the American fighting spirit. Until then, they had believed the enemy depended entirely on mass production, that his strength came from factories, not individuals. But here was an American who embodied unpredictability, who defied their doctrines with a weapon they dismissed as a toy. As George moved along the ridge that January morning, he felt none of the pride or triumph later ascribed to him in military journals. His world narrowed to the faint, almost imperceptible movements of the enemy. Each time he exhaled and squeezed the trigger, the symbolic sound of that rolling cartridge echoed in his mind, a reminder that every shot was part of something larger than himself. Historical records from the 132nd Infantry confirmed the staggering efficiency of his week-long hunt. Japanese diaries recovered near Point Cruz spoke of an invisible American marksman who fired with the stillness of the trees, and who knew the mind of the forest. One entry described the fear spreading among their ranks. "He waits for our breath. When we breathe, he sees us." This was not the portrait of a factory-made soldier. It was the image of a frontier marksman, a type of warrior the Axis had never accounted for. Military analysts later used John George's performance as evidence that American soldiers carried more individual adaptability than the German command believed possible. In Europe, Germany prized uniformity and precision. In the Pacific, America revealed a different strength, the ability to combine personal experience with battlefield necessity in ways foreign powers could not predict. And always, there was the rifle, the civilian hunting piece that symbolized a nation where the line between citizen and soldier blurred. In Germany, a rifle was issued. In America, it was inherited, practiced with, understood. The walnut stock in George's hands represented not amateurism but freedom, the freedom to know a tool personally, to master it outside the boundaries of formal doctrine. As the week ended and the jungle quieted, the transformation was complete. German arrogance about American marksmanship had cracked. Japanese commanders, once confident in their sniper superiority, wrote warnings to future units: "Do not underestimate the farmers. They shoot as though born with rifles." When George finally stepped away from the ridge, exhausted and mud-stained, the jungle no longer felt like enemy ground. It felt like a place where American improvisation had beaten European ideology. 29 elite marksmen, silenced in 7 days, by a man whose greatest asset was not his weapon but the quiet patience of his upbringing. In later years, when historians looked back on Guadalcanal, they often spoke of logistics, airfields, and naval battles. But buried within those larger narratives was this solitary duel: one man, one rifle, and 1 week that reframed how Germany and Japan viewed the American soldier. And so the story returns to that symbolic sound, the faint clink of a rolling cartridge. It is the sound of a nation that does not rely solely on factories or regulations. It is the sound of a country where individuals learn to master their tools long before war requires it. A sound that traveled from a wooden porch in Kansas to the jungle of Guadalcanal, carrying with it a quiet truth the Axis never understood until it was too late. For in that week of relentless precision, America revealed that its power did not rest merely in numbers or machines. It rested in the unshakable spirit of ordinary men who could, when the moment demanded, rise to extraordinary heights. And in the silence left behind on that ridge, the lesson endured, a reminder that freedom, when tested, finds its sharpest expression in the hands of those who choose to defend it with skill, patience, and unwavering resolve. The week that followed brought a different quiet to the American lines. Not the tense stillness of waiting for an unseen enemy, but the heavy calm that settles over men who finally feel the jungle breathing with them rather than against them. Patrols moved with more confidence, stepping along the ridges where, only days before, no one dared expose a silhouette. The mortar teams who once crouched anxiously behind driftwood revetments now worked with methodical rhythm. Even the company runners, usually wary of every shadow, found themselves moving in straighter paths, less haunted by the memory of sudden single shots. Yet for Lieutenant John George, the silence carried another weight, an understanding that his week of work had shifted the battlefield in ways not immediately visible. The Japanese had not simply lost 29 of their most skilled marksmen, they had lost the invisible pressure that had pinned entire American companies in place. Without sniper dominance, their ability to control the movement of enemy troops, to restrict supply lines, and to bleed momentum from advancing units had collapsed. American after-action reports noted the change. In their margins, in quick pencil strokes made by tired officers under dim lanterns, the same word appeared: freedom. Not the political kind, but the literal absence of fear, the ability to move a limb without risking death, to raise one's head without imagining a hidden muzzle glinting from a thicket. But the Japanese noticed the shift as well. Diaries recovered from abandoned dugouts told of meetings held under kerosene lamps, where junior officers spoke in hushed tones, wondering how one American rifleman had undone their carefully laid perimeter. They tried to rationalize it through endurance, luck, or unusual familiarity with the jungle, yet none of those answers satisfied the deeper wound. Their doctrine had failed them, a doctrine borrowed and shaped through German instruction, rooted in belief that discipline, concealment, and patience could create superiority in any terrain. This failure weighed heavily on them. In several accounts, enemy observers wrote that their men began avoiding certain patches of jungle simply because, as one entry stated, the American hunter has taken the spirits of this land. It was superstition born from exhaustion, but it reflected something more profound, a crack in morale, a recognition that the battlefield no longer favored them in the way they once believed it did. John George saw these shifts not through documents, those would come later, but through behavior he caught in the rifle's scope. Enemy movement, once deliberate and confident, grew hesitant. Soldiers no longer crossed clearings in the same bold strides. Even their camouflage, once precise, began showing signs of rushed preparation. Badly placed fronds, exposed rifle barrels, unnatural shadows. Their rhythm had broken. It was the kind of imbalance a sniper feels intuitively, the way an experienced woodsman notices that a forest animal is behaving out of season. During midday lulls, George would sit with the rifle across his lap, running a cloth along the smooth grain. By then, the symbolic sound had grown louder in his mind, the soft clink of a cartridge rolling across a table. It reminded him not of victory, but of discipline, of the years spent learning the weight of a shot and the patience required to make it count. That sound had shaped him far more than any manual or military directive. It represented a distinctly American inheritance, a relationship to the rifle that existed long before uniformed service. This symbolism cut into the heart of the Axis miscalculation. Germany believed mastery came from rigid structure, hours of regimented training, precise commands, and generations of military theory. Japan adopted this belief enthusiastically, applying it with near-religious devotion. But America's strength grew from a different soil. It came from irregular practice, personal experimentation, the freedom to learn from land and weather rather than from prescribed doctrine. As combat units pushed deeper along Point Cruz, they found themselves relying not on the textbook tactics of stateside instructors but on the instinctive adjustments of men who had spent years hunting in forests, deserts, and plains. These instincts allowed them to move through the jungle with a natural understanding the Japanese found difficult to counter. Their perception widened. They read shadows as signs, wind as information, and distant rustles as warnings. In that sense, the American soldier was not a product of uniformity. He was an accumulation of personal experience, stitched together by opportunity. For Germany, this realization arrived slowly. Reports from Japanese liaison officers described an enemy capable of shifting roles without breakdown, riflemen who became scouts, mechanics who became gunners, and, as the case of George demonstrated, a young lieutenant who became one of the most efficient snipers in the region despite carrying a weapon that theoretically disqualified him from professional status. This elasticity of skill contradicted the very foundation of German belief, that war favored the trained specialist over the adaptive individual. Meanwhile, within the American perimeter, the effects of George's success rippled outward. Platoon leaders began adjusting their confidence levels, pushing patrols farther, scouting deeper. The fear that had once gripped their every step faded, replaced by something steadier, not triumph, but trust. They trusted that if the enemy returned with another wave of sniper pressure, George or someone like him could break it again. And so the ridge became more than a strategic point. It became a reminder of what an individual could accomplish when circumstance aligned with skill. The men who passed through the area noted the quiet strangely. Some said it felt like walking through a church. Others described it as a hollow place where the jungle seemed to watch them instead of the other way around. But all of them recognized that something rare had happened there, something that shifted the invisible balance of the campaign. In the evenings, when the fires were reduced to embers and the rain softened to mist, the men would speak quietly about the week George spent hunting. They didn't glorify it. They didn't recount it with excitement or bravado. Instead, they spoke the way farmers talk about a season of hard weather finally breaking, with relief, gratitude, and the sober understanding that survival often hinges on one person doing a job no one else can. George himself rarely joined these conversations. He cleaned his rifle, wrote in small notebooks, and prepared for whatever the jungle might demand next. His thoughts stayed focused not on the praise but on the method, the patterns, the angles, the subtle signs of an enemy still watching from deeper within the hills. For though the ridge had quieted, the war itself had not. What Germany failed to understand, and what Guadalcanal proved, was that American strength did not rise or fall based on equipment alone. It came from citizens who carried into battle skills forged long before uniforms were issued. The walnut rifle stock resting against George's knee was not a symbol of shortage or improvisation. It was a symbol of continuity, the continuity between a nation's heritage and its battlefield presence. When historians later examined letters, journals, and unit transcripts, they realized the deeper truth, that the American soldier's identity was shaped not by doctrine but by familiarity with responsibility. The rifle was more than a tool, it was a cultural artifact. It connected childhood practice to wartime necessity, linking generations through a quiet, unbroken thread. And so the ridge at Point Cruz stood not as a monument to one marksman's kill count, but as a place where the illusion of Axis superiority began to fracture. Where Germany's laughter, dismissive, confident, born from years of unchecked victories, faded into silence. A silence created by patience, precision, and a man who understood that a single well-placed shot carries more meaning than all the noise of misplaced arrogance. The jungle remembered that week. The American soldiers who walked its paths never forgot it. And somewhere in the archives of Berlin and Tokyo, analysts would later underline a single line in the margin of an intelligence report: "The Americans do not fight as we expect them to. They fight as they choose. This makes them dangerous." The days that followed brought an unusual clarity to Guadalcanal, as if the constant haze that hovered over the island had lifted for a brief, fragile moment. American patrols pushed farther into the jungle, stepping into terrain that had once been considered untouchable because of the Japanese sniper presence. The air was still heavy with humidity, but the psychological weight that had pressed down on every movement seemed to lighten. The men could sense it even if they didn't fully understand it, a shift in momentum, subtle yet unmistakable. Along the ridge lines, fresh positions were dug, not out of fear but to secure ground that had suddenly opened like a new frontier. The silence, once suffocating, now felt spacious. No single shot cracked through the undergrowth. No sudden yell of "Sniper!" rippled from squad to squad. It was as if the jungle itself was adjusting its breath, recalibrating after a week of tension so tight it had felt like a wire stretched to breaking. For the Japanese, the absence of their elite marksmen delivered an unexpected paralysis. Snipers were not just shooters, they were psychological anchors. They controlled American movement, delayed advances, and shaped morale. Without them, the perimeter thinned, leaving gaps in places where Japanese commanders once believed themselves untouchable. Their frontline infantry suddenly felt exposed, as if invisible shields had vanished overnight. Captured documents would later reveal their confusion. Some officers believed the American sniper presence had increased drastically. Others insisted a new type of rifle or technology had arrived with reinforcements. A more superstitious strain began to surface too, the belief that the jungle spirits had turned against them, favoring the Americans. In one recovered note, a junior officer recorded, "A new hunter walks with them. We cannot see him, but we feel him." It was not mysticism. It was the consequence of losing 29 trained eyes. John George did not allow himself to dwell on numbers. If anything, the count unnerved him. He had grown up in a world where a single clean shot was considered enough for food, enough for necessity, enough for survival. But here, under military urgency, the arithmetic had taken on a scale no civilian hunter ever sought. Still, he kept moving. He checked angles, studied new vantage points, calculated ranges, and noted where the Japanese might attempt to rebuild their sniper nests. The walnut rifle remained calm against his hands, its grain absorbing the moisture without swelling, its stock fitted to his shoulder as if shaped by instinct rather than craftsmanship. The symbolic sound of the rolling cartridge returned again and again in these moments. It echoed through memory like a warning against arrogance. A reminder that skill without humility becomes recklessness. It also reminded him of why he was here, not to outmatch doctrine, but to protect men who depended on him without ever saying so. Within the American lines, stories about his week became distorted in the way frontline stories often do. Some claimed he could see through foliage like glass. Others insisted he could hear enemy breath at 100 yards. A few said the rifle itself had a spirit, that it refused to miss. But those who worked closest with him knew the truth was simpler, and far more grounded. George studied his environment with the dedication of a man who understood that mistakes were not measured in reprimands but in casualties. The shifting tide on Guadalcanal worried the Japanese higher command. Reports reached them describing American troops moving with renewed assertiveness, probing deeper into the perimeter and forcing nighttime skirmishes in areas once dominated by Imperial forces. The loss of sniper coverage meant their infantry had to expose themselves in ways they were not trained to. Their carefully orchestrated ambushes faltered, their communication lines grew vulnerable, and their commanders found themselves reacting rather than directing. In Tokyo, German advisors observing the Pacific Campaign analyzed these reports with increasing discomfort. The performance of the American sniper contradicted their long-standing assessments. Their propaganda had shaped a myth of American softness, of men who relied on machines rather than skill. But here was evidence of a different truth, one that challenged a decade of ideological assumption. One analyst wrote, "The Americans do not require strict doctrine for excellence. Their independence creates irregular mastery." Irregular mastery. It was a phrase that unsettled German planners more than they admitted, because it suggested unpredictability, the one-element military doctrine fears most. As American forces pushed gradually through the ravines and tangled vines west of Point Cruz, George's presence became more than tactical. It became a quiet reassurance. Men who had once flinched at the whisper of leaves now steadied themselves before stepping into open ground, trusting that the unseen threat had been blunted. They carried packs more confidently, spoke with less strain, even breathed differently. War does this. It turns survival into rhythm, and fear into habit. When fear loosens, even slightly, the human body recognizes it instantly. One afternoon, as engineers worked on clearing a supply trail, the unit chaplain paused near the ridge and described the silence as too large for the world. It was an odd phrasing, but the men understood what he meant. The quiet was not the absence of danger, it was the aftermath of a contest that one side had decisively lost. Yet George knew the Japanese would adapt. He had studied enough of their tactics to understand they would not abandon sniping altogether. They would send replacements. They would study the ridgeline the way he once studied deer bedding sites, learning how their predecessors had been found and eliminated. That knowledge kept him from feeling any sense of completion. Victory in the jungle was temporary. Advantage shifted like light through canopy leaves. Still, the ridge carried a presence that endured, not a monument, not a legend, but a subtle reminder of how quickly the balance of a battlefield can change when a single individual performs with unwavering consistency. Historians would later debate the extent of this shift. Some argued that George's week did not alter the overall timeline of the Guadalcanal campaign. Others believed it accelerated American momentum substantially. Yet both views acknowledged one truth, that Japan's confidence in its elite snipers suffered a blow it never fully recovered from. And somewhere within all those interpretations, the walnut stock of George's rifle remained a symbol, not of rustic simplicity, but of a nation whose strength came from ordinary citizens who treated skill as a personal responsibility long before war demanded it. The Axis powers understood machinery, formations, ideology. But they never fully understood the American relationship to individual capability. The jungle, however, understood it well. For nature does not respect doctrine. It respects patience, awareness, and the calm discipline of a steady breath. And on that ridge, those qualities reshaped a corner of the Pacific War. Night returned to Guadalcanal with the same heavy cloak of humidity, but something in its texture had changed. Before, darkness meant danger. Men saw it as the hour when Japanese snipers became most patient, most precise, and most willing to fire a single round that stole a life before anyone could respond. But now the night felt different. It no longer belonged entirely to the enemy. Patrols moved through it with measured confidence, guided by the belief that the unseen threat had been weakened in a way few had imagined possible. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to adjust. Losing 29 snipers was not just a tactical loss. It was the erosion of a doctrine they considered unbreakable. Their sniper corps relied on endurance, ritual, discipline, and an assumption that their opponents lacked the same intimate relationship with marksmanship. But the events of George's week disrupted that belief at its foundation. Replacement snipers were rushed forward, men who were brave, but not yet adapted to the island's demands. Their movements lacked the fluidity of the earlier elite marksmen. They made small mistakes that only the jungle noticed at first. American scouts reported seeing carelessly broken branches in places where Japanese snipers once left no trace. They noticed footprints too deep, rifles held at angles that reflected brief glints of moonlight, and camouflage mats woven without the subtle layering needed to blend into the humid undergrowth. These errors did not go unpunished. American patrols began neutralizing new sniper positions before they became threats, guided not by superior equipment, but by the changed psychology of the battlefield. George's week had taught them the signs, the patterns, the faint markers of danger. George himself spent more time observing than firing. His notebook pages filled with sketches of ridge lines, angles of descent, light shifts through foliage. His aim was not to seek glory, it was to prevent Japanese snipers from regaining the initiative. He understood that the most dangerous enemy was the one who learned quickly. And he expected Japan to learn. In a few cases they did. American units encountered snipers who had adopted new techniques, such as relocating several times a day instead of remaining in static positions. They shifted from traditional vantage points to unconventional ones, tree crotches, drainage cuts, even abandoned American foxholes. These adjustments showed that Japanese leadership had studied their losses carefully and sought to adapt. But they lacked the one element they needed most: time. Replacements were forced into action faster than they could master their surroundings. The jungle was not a forgiving teacher. It revealed mistakes only after they had become fatal. Beyond the island, the shock waves traveled farther. In Berlin, German staff officers reviewed intelligence summaries sent through liaison channels. They read the reports with suppressed irritation. It was not the kill count that unsettled them. Germany had long accepted high attrition in specialized units. What disturbed them was what the event implied about American character. A lieutenant with no formal sniper training had dismantled a network of highly disciplined Japanese marksmen using a rifle that German officers considered a sporting novelty. This contradicted a decade of ideological narrative. German doctrine insisted that military superiority came from structure, rigorous training, codified methods, and strict hierarchy. The idea that an American civilian skill set could produce battlefield excellence without years of specialized schooling was almost heretical. It suggested that American strength did not depend on doctrine, but on individual competence, a trait impossible to predict, control, or quantify through traditional intelligence methods. In several internal memos, German analysts expressed concern about what they termed cultural adaptability. They noted that American soldiers, unlike their Axis counterparts, often arrived on the battlefield with skills acquired through non-military life: mechanical aptitude, hunting experience, frontier tracking, familiarity with firearms. These skills were not standardized, yet proved effective because they were flexible. One analyst wrote, "They do not need instruction to innovate. They improvise as naturally as we breathe." This statement circulated quietly, but its implications were profound. If true, it meant the American war machine was not defined solely by industry or numbers, but by citizens whose everyday experiences translated into battlefield advantage. On Guadalcanal itself, this truth became visible in small but telling ways. Infantrymen began relying more on self-taught techniques, adjusting their gear, modifying their approach routes, and sharing tactics learned from observing George's work. They watched how he read wind, how he predicted enemy patience, how he measured quiet. Not all of them became marksmen, but all of them absorbed the principle that survival and success came from understanding the environment rather than forcing doctrine upon it. Japanese diaries reflected this shift as well. Some entries described Americans as men who hunt without rules. Others called them fighters shaped by the land, a phrase intended as criticism but which captured something essential. Japanese forces, trained within rigid boundaries of obedience and discipline, struggled to comprehend an enemy who operated with fluidity. Their combat philosophy depended on predictability, the expectation that soldiers who lacked strict training could not become formidable threats. George shattered that belief. As American patrols advanced, the jungle grew louder with movement, the clatter of canteens, the low murmur of coordination, the soft tread of boots moving in patterns once avoided. It was progress made possible not by overwhelming force, but by breaking the psychological grip of enemy snipers. The ridge that had once served as a silent boundary now marked a shift in control. The Americans had taken ownership of the terrain, and terrain ownership meant momentum. Yet amid the shifting tides, George remained grounded. Each night he cleaned the rifle with slow, deliberate strokes. The walnut stock smelled faintly of moisture and oil, carrying hints of earth and memory. And every time a cartridge rolled across the table, its faint metallic sound reminded him of responsibility, the same symbolic cadence that had followed him since his first day in the Solomons. That sound had become a kind of anchor, a quiet reminder that a single shot carried weight far beyond the battlefield. In the broader war, this symbolism echoed deeper. It represented not just a marksman's craft, but a nation's deeper truth, that American strength, when stripped of mythology, was less about ideology and more about opportunity. The ability for an individual to develop skill independently, to refine it outside the limits of formal instruction, and to rely on it under pressure. That was the real contrast between the Allied and Axis worldviews. The Japanese could replace rifles. Germany could adjust doctrine. But neither could replicate the cultural inheritance that turned ordinary citizens into experts when necessity demanded it. And so, as the jungle settled again into its uneasy rhythm, Guadalcanal became a lesson written not in textbooks, but in the quiet of one man's discipline. A lesson the Axis observed too late, and one the Allies would carry forward as they prepared for the long campaigns that still lay ahead.